Welcome to Live from Jerusalem. Notre Dame faculty discuss recent events and their repercussions. Thank you for joining our event, which is co-sponsored by the University of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, part of the Kia School of Global Affairs, and the University of Notre Dame at Notre, Jerusalem, one of the university's global gateways and centers, part of the Notre Dame International. My name is Daniel Shvaka, and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Notre Dame at Notre, joining you from Jerusalem. Joining the panel from this part of the world are also faculty members and instructors at the University of Notre Dame at Notre, Avrum Burg and Sari Nusseibeh. Avrum Burg is an Israeli politician, scholar, and author of multiple books, including The Holocaust is Over, We Must Rise from Its Ashes. Avrum Burg was a leading member of the Labour Party, a member of the Knesset, chairman of the Jewish Agency for Israel, speaker of the Knesset, and an interim president of Israel. Sari Nusseibeh is a Palestinian professor of philosophy with degrees from Oxford University and Harvard. He was a leader and activist for nonviolent civil disobedience during the First Intifada. He rose to become the representative of the Palestinian Authority in Jerusalem and then the president of Al-Quds University. Sari Nusseibeh has published multiple books, including the best-selling Once Upon a Country, A Palestinian Life. To help us navigate through this discussion and to ensure we're informative, challenged, and relevant, especially from our viewers from the US, we have Notre Dame faculty colleagues joining the panel from South Bend, Indiana. That is Atalia Omer and Asher Kaufman. Atalia Omer is professor of religion, conflict, and peace studies at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. Atalia Omer earned her PhD at Harvard University and is considered a cutting-edge researcher in the field of peace studies. Asher Kaufman will be moderating this discussion. Asher Kaufman is a professor of history and peace studies and director of the John M. Region Junior Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. He received his PhD from Brandeis University and has worked at the Hebrew University before joining Notre Dame. His region of expertise is the modern Middle East, with a particular focus on Lebanon, Israel, and Syria. We all stand full of horror to the death and violence in our region. In the current round of violence alone, 63 children have been reported killed. 61 were killed in Gaza Strip and 2 in Israel. I will obviously not be able to name all these children, but here's a glimpse, just a glimpse, of what I could find. Yara and Trulka Kaulak were 9 and 5 years old. Ido Avigal was 5 years old. Nadine Awad was 16 years old. Suhaib, Yahya, Abdurrahman, and Osama al-Hadidi, yes, all from the same family, were 13, 11, 8, and 6 years old. I don't think there's any word powerful enough to articulate our emotions when we hear of the death of these innocent children. May they all rest in peace. Irrespective of what the viewers now think in terms of who's to blame for their death, I truly hope we all agree that their death is in vain and could and should have been avoided. In addition to these horrific deaths, we're also seeing violent protests in Jerusalem and the West Bank. We're watching neighbors turning on each other as mobs in mixed cities of Israel, threatening to tear that fine texture of what some have hoped to become the model of coexistence. In the midst of all of this, our panelist Avrum Burg writes, "There are people of peace everywhere. It's time to connect them. It's precisely now, out of the war, that this connection can be formed. This moment distills between the good of all camps and the bad on both sides. It must be transformed from a sense of individuals into a meaningful political connection." Avrum Burg's quote does not come out of a void. It comes out of what seems like a deliberate philosophical worldview of hope. And I dare to say that he shares this notion with his counterpart from Jerusalem, Sari Nusseibeh, who dedicated his autobiography to his father due to the sense of hope of the latter. Over the past few years, writes Nusseibeh, I've seen my share of smashed dreams, but like my father, I believe that human life is much more than the sum total of all our mistakes. Rubble, he used to tell me, often makes the best building materials. These two intellectuals are not just speakers of truth to power, considering the different power structures in which both dwell, nor do they just keep a Socratic notion of assuming their ignorance, not trying to explain complex series of events in retrospect. Most importantly, reading and listening to Sari, Nusseibeh, and Avram Borg is like inhaling hope. I've experienced this especially in my role as executive director, listening to Avram and Sari talk to our students and program participants. We, especially here in this area of the world right now, clinch to such hope like a shipwrecked sailor clinging to a wood log, keeping him from drowning into the infinite sea of hopelessness. Howard Zinn had much better and much more powerful words to describe that notion. To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act and at least the possibility of sending the spinning top of a world in a different direction. And if we do act in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. To live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory. Please allow me to thank Avram Borg and Sari Nusseibeh for willing to share their views with us tonight. I'm grateful also for Atalia Omer and Asher Kaufman, who were able to magically find time in their schedule this week to join and set up this very important and timely panel. With that note, I wish us an honest, productive, and constructive discussion. Asher, I turn the word to you in South Bend.
Thank you, Daniel, for your introduction and for the initiative to have this panel that brings all of us together. In fact, faculty of Notre Dame here at in South Bend and in Jerusalem. Notre Dame is in a unique position vis-a-vis Israel, Palestine, in that it is one of the very few universities that actually have a campus in Jerusalem, a campus that holds vibrant academic programs managed by the university. Tantur, as we all know, houses also a Christian ecumenical institute and plays an important role in the life of Christian communities in the land. And it also functions as a safe haven for Jews and Arabs, Christians and Muslims alike, to come together in one really beautiful space. It is one of these sites in the country in which coexistence, with all of its challenges and contradictions, is not an empty cliche, but actually a lived experience. One of the missions of Tantur, and I quote, is participating in the search for world peace and justice through theological study and through exploration of human rights and conflict resolution in different religious and social contexts. This part of the mission of Tantur is strongly in line with the mission of the Kroc Institute, which also seeks to study human rights and conflict resolution or transformation in different religious and social contexts. I would like to add my endorsement, strong endorsement, to Daniel's introductory remarks concerning the spirit of the conversation we are about to have. In the midst of this wave of violence, we need to find the existing bridges that are still standing. These people of peace that Avram Borg was writing about a few days ago in Haaretz. I hope this conversation of us will add to this effort of building these bridges. I'll turn now to the speakers, starting with the people on the ground, Sari, Nusseibeh, and Avram Borg. And I asked each one of them to share with us their own thoughts, their experiences from about what is happening now. And I'll start with Sari, who I believe is in Jericho right now. You need to unmute yourself, Sari.
Thank you very much. Yes, I came down today to Jericho from Jerusalem after about 11 days. I live just next door to the area of Sheikh Jarrah, where there's been a lot of trouble over the question of the families, the 28 families, under threat of being thrown out of their houses. Now, today has been quieter, and so I decided I can give myself time off and came down here, much quieter in Jericho. Let me just say, first of all, that I'm very honored, glad to be a participant in this panel, which I hope will be useful to your audience, to everybody, as well as to me, because I also am in need of finding answers to a lot of questions that are on my mind, as I'm sure they are on the minds of other people. I'm very happy to be joining this panel with an old friend, Avram. We meet every now and again. When we meet, I think we exchange a spirit of hope between us. I walk away feeling good that I've met him, and I have the suspicion that he has the same kind of reaction also when he leaves. Let me say one or two things about what I see happening. And I wish to go beyond the gruesome details and gruesome views that we've all been looking at over the past 2 weeks, 3 weeks, to say something more general. And what I want to say is the following, and I hope it will raise questions in our minds concerning what it is that we're seeing happening in front of us, what it is that needs to be done, what are the problems. Now, very strangely, I want to say that the recent events, the gruesome events that we've been witnessing over the past, especially 2 weeks, have brought to the forefront, in my opinion, three very basic and simmering problems that the Israeli-Palestinian, so-called Israeli-Palestinian conflict has had for a very long time. As we know, this is a conflict that's been going on for many years. One problem that it has brought out is Israel itself as a Jewish state or as a democratic state. The issue that was pointed out earlier, I think by Dan, when he talked about the so-called social fabric within Israel between Israeli Jews and Israeli Palestinians. Now, what we saw, what we witnessed over the past 2 weeks or 3 weeks was an image which made us think that maybe there's a problem there that needs to be solved, that it was there somehow simmering underneath the surface perhaps, but it just came out. And therefore, long term, I think one has to address that and to see how that can be worked on in order to create a better future. The second problem, I think it upfronted, the events in the past 2 weeks upfronted, was the problem of refugees. Now, it so happened that the issue when the trouble started 3 weeks ago or whenever, they started over the area of where about 28 Palestinian families who originally were refugees from within the pre-67 lines came over to East Jerusalem, which was at the time under Jordan, which became under Jordan. Now, with the court problems that were taking place, the issue was slowly brewing, and finally it exploded in the last few weeks. And it was the issue of whether refugees can ever have a proper life. You know, having been removed from their earlier habitats in what later came to be Israel, having come to settle in what then came to be under Jordan, whether again they have to be removed from their houses, and removed from their houses where? Not back to their original properties, but somewhere else. So it created or brought back again, upfronted the problem of refugees. So that's the second problem, I think, that was upfronted. The third problem was Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, of course, the whole thing centers around the old city, and in particular around the area of the mosque. And of course, it's a very sort of a combustible issue. And again, it made us remember, it reminded us that this is an explosive issue that needs to be addressed. So what I'm saying is that in some roundabout way, the recent events, regardless of how they started, who started them, regardless of the consequences, regardless of the pain and so on, brought to the forefront three underlying issues in the Arab-Israeli conflict, so-called, that have to be addressed, that people on both sides have to address. And I think until we address them properly, we will never be able to actually have a peaceful life in the future. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sari. Avram, the floor is yours to share with us your first reflections from your standpoint.
Good evening, good afternoon, whatever it is. What is there with you? Good afternoon, I take it, right?
Right.
I'm so happy to be here in this company of loved, I won't say old friend, because he philosophically will immediately say how you define old, but old friend Sari and Daniel, which I see daily, and Asher and all of you, and Natalia. Every day that I come in the morning to my cave, and I'm sorry, Daniel, that's my Aplatonian cave, okay, in Tantu, I say to myself, wow, I'm privileged. I live in an oasis of peace. And now at the moment in which at the back room, they discussed in the news, the terms of ceasefire, which means every side say, we do it unilaterally, as if they don't talk to each other, as if they do not coordinate, as if there is no relationship. I do it unilaterally, you do it unilaterally. And then it happens, I don't know, somehow I say to myself, there is no better time for the peace studies and the peace philosophy of Notre Dame than this moment. I mean, hostility is more or less over, a quarter to over, and soon we're about to talk about the post-war reality, and that's the time to talk about it. Many people will continue to talk the language of aggression, and the language of violence, because this is the lingua franca between us and the Hamas and us and some of the Palestinians. But I think that the challenge of an evening like today is to introduce a different kind of syntax to the conversation, and maybe later on build on it. What was this round? On one hand, it was a very old talk and very old fashioned of mine is bigger. Mine is bigger, yours is bigger, my technology, your missiles, my missiles, I kill more, you kill more. Okay, we know it, we've been there, we heard it. The numbers are awful and the sentiments are very, very, I will say, narcissistic and self-centered. Palestinian counting their deaths, Israelis counting their casualties, and very few people, I will say, like us here, count the folly, casualties and victims of both sides. Having said that, I have a feeling that we see an outbreak of maybe a new reality. Maybe. And if there is an outbreak of a new reality, can we trust it? Can we build on it? Maybe it's still a dune, still sands are not stabilized. But let me try to describe the outline of this new reality. I will call the first introduction for it, or the introduction for it, de-Trumpism of the political science of the region. Came Donald Trump, the famous, some will say infamous, but I would say famous American diplomat, philosopher, intellectual, and peacemaker, and said, I moved the embassy to Jerusalem and I removed Jerusalem off the table. Yalla, no Jerusalem. Sari, you do not exist anymore, okay? Trump removed you from the table, like a little bit of some crumbles, but you're not there anymore. Came Netanyahu, like the best David Copperfield of the region, kind of a mentalist that can make realities disappear, and said, listen, I have the Abraham agreements, the Abraham Accords, and I made the Palestinian problem disappear. Abracadabra, hocus pocus, no Palestinian problem. All of a sudden, I have something with the periphery, nothing inside, no Palestinian problem. And everybody applauded. The Palestinians disappear. So poor Sari, for the second time, it disappeared. First as a Jerusalemite, then as a Palestinian. And all of a sudden, as eloquently as Sari described the occurrences of the last couple of weeks, it's all back. And it's all back big time, and it's all back differently. What we see in this war is, in a very violent way, via missiles rather than via diplomacy, Gaza is well connected to the West Bank. No Palestinian National Unity government, no national reconciliation, but Gaza and the West Bank are one as for now. The second is Jerusalem. As much as we Jewish Israelis would like to ignore the problem, is the center of the epicenter of the issue. You cannot ignore it, not just symbolically, but politically and municipality and what have you. Then what do you see? That not only Hamas is a kind of an offspring of the Muslim, the Cairo Egyptian Muslim brothers and the political Islam all over the world, it is also a very important religious element at the Palestinian side, corresponds very, very eloquently and very, very interestingly with the more religious traditional elements at the Israeli conservative side. And the conflict that when we first learn what is it all about, at Sari's childhood, my childhood, and our youth as activists for peace on both sides, that we thought it's two national communities colliding, so let's see what we can do about it. The conflict deteriorates more and more and more and more into the religious dimension of it. And last but not least, for the first time since 48, all the 5 components of the Palestinian split in a way begin to unify. Gaza, West Bank, Jerusalem, Lebanon, and inner Israel. All of a sudden, it's the same problem with different manifestations, but it is all of a sudden there. And now you say to yourself, if this is the new reality, on one hand, I can expect or predict that many of the right-wing neocons of Israel who were educated or conditioned or indoctrinated by Netanyahu's paradigm to see fear as the main driver of their philosophy and their politics, I see how frightening it is. I see how troubling it is. But on the other hand, I say to myself, on the other hand, it's an opportunity. Because if this is the issue, we have so many interfaces that we didn't have before to try to unfold some of the elements of the problem. For example, within Israel, with the Arab society, yes, there are terrible issues that the Israeli governments neglected and abandoned and manipulated and actually gave room to criminal families to run the show there in order for the state not to assume responsibility in a very, very cynical way. The same way Netanyahu and Netanyahu's cronies see the Palestinian Authority as a subcontractor for occupation in the West Bank, they see the criminal families as a subcontractor to divide and conquer the Arab society within Israel. But at the same time, during COVID time and Corona time, we were exposed to beautiful manifestations of the intellectuals and the physicians and the pharmacists and the civil society and the municipal responsibility of the Arab society. And many say, it's not a fifth column. It's not just the enemy from within, it's the real partner. And the potential for partnership is there within Israel. Many people in Israel say, not enough, we don't have a critical mass, we don't have yet a political power. It was not yet translated into political power, but many are ready to listen to the argument that says, even in times of war, it is not all of us versus all of them automatically. It is not a tribe versus tribe. It's not a genetic or ethnical collective versus a genetic ethnical collective. It's much more Hannah Arendt philosophy. I'm married to ideas and I'm partnered with people who share the same value system as I do, rather than automatically belong to my tribe. And when you saw Jerusalem only yesterday, not enough, but some people going from Jaffa Gate to Newgate in a life chain of holding hands, Jews and Arabs together, and saying, we are here to manifest in the middle of the war that we would like to see an alternative way of life, an alternative paradigm for the existence here. You say to yourself, there is something there. My daughter-in-law, she is a family physician in Jaffa. She opened the clinic. She has Jews and local Palestinian clients and patients. Do the shopping there. The kids are going together to school with local Palestinian kids, speak fluent Arabic since kindergarten and on. And you say to yourself, with enough seeds like this, all of a sudden, maybe an alternative grows bottom up that eventually will defeat the policy of fears of top-down Netanyahu. And I believe that this war actually pushed everybody to the extreme, and everybody has to take kind of a position. What will be the right wing position? I know. It's a challenge of what will be my friends and my colleagues and my political side position. What I will offer them, what I'm offering them and what I will offer them and not offer alone is, do me a favor. Stop counting states. Let's start to count rights and liberties first, because every individual between the Jordan and the Mediterranean has the right to have the same rights. Once we have this as a constitutional ground floor, the rest will follow.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Avrom and Sari, for your introductory remarks. We already have lots of food for thought and continue the conversation, but I would like to bring in Atalia to our conversation, and perhaps also the United States. Atalia, you have been working, one of your areas of expertise is US-based activism towards this conflict. Can you share with us your thoughts about what is happening now from this perspective?
Yeah, first of all, I wanted to express my thank yous for being included in this panel with two other panelists whom I admire. Sari, we met a long time ago when I was a graduate student at Harvard, and I responded to a paper or a presentation that you gave, and I just remember one sentence that you said, that you can't afford being a pessimist. And I've kind of carried with me, I'll never forget that sentence. And of course, Avrom Burg, I've been following you for a long time, so it's such an honor
You're
to be. Yes, exactly. So I have prepared remarks to respond to Asher's question about the perspective of American Jewish Palestine solidarity activists, or relationship to Israeli policies and kind of critical engagement with Israeli policies. But before I start, I want to acknowledge my presence on the traditional homelands of Native peoples, including the primarily the Pokageg Potawatomi, who have been using this land for education for thousands of years and continue to do so. I start with this land acknowledgement because one of the hardest things I have done in my life as an Israeli Jew is to see myself as a part of a settler colonial history. This is not the same as saying that it's only reduced to a settler colonial analysis, but I just wanted to acknowledge this. So today, May 20th, 2021, as probably many people on this call are aware of, Senator Bernie Sanders will be or already introduced a resolution intent on stopping the US sale of $735 million in precision-guided weapons to Israel, the same weapon that is being used in the massacre in Gaza. Sanders said in a statement to the Washington Post, quote, "At a moment when US-made bombs are devastating Gaza and killing women and children, We cannot simply let another huge arms sales go through without even a congressional debate. End of quote. Meanwhile, in the House of Representatives, there is a similar unprecedented departure from kind of rubber stamping arms sale and unconditional aid to Israel, with outspoken representatives such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York and Rashida Tlaib from Michigan. So AOC said it powerfully, quote, for decades, the US has sold billions of dollars in weaponry to Israel without ever requiring them to respect basic Palestinian rights. In so doing, we have directly contributed to the death, displacement, and disenfranchisement of millions, end of quote. So this sense of complicity as tax-paying American citizens also animates American Jewish critics of Israeli policies. Now, during the latest manifestation of an assault on Gaza, but also prior, especially in the past decade or so. So in my recent book, it's titled Days of Awe, Reimagining Jewishness in Solidarity with Palestinians, I trace the emergence and consolidation of Jewish American discourse that engages not only in an abstract critique of American militarism and its global and international ramifications in terms of where American taxpayers' dollars are invested and what atrocities they underwrite. The American Jewish critics are what I call are critical, also specifically in terms of their Jewish complicity in the actions of Israel. In this case, war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza and against the Palestinian people broadly. So in the book, I highlight this as a process that I called critical caretaking, as Jewish activists who engage in Palestine solidarity and sometimes in what they term co-resistance against the Israeli occupation of Palestinians, are fully immersed in a critique of the kind of hegemony of Zionist interpretation of Jewish history, memory, and meaning. But they do not remain only in the space of critique. Indeed, they cannot afford staying there because they are compelled to act as Jews against what is being done supposedly in their name as Jews and for their safety and or redemption. And this is where critical caretaking comes in. Therefore, these Jewish activists are not only critics, but also caretakers. The move toward critical resistance involves refiguring Jewishness as other-centric rather than ethnocentric. Many Jewish American actors critical of Israeli policies and even those who consider themselves explicitly as non or anti-Zionist interpret an understanding of Jewish liberation or emancipation in the form of an ethno-religious nationalism as constituting kind of the wrong lesson of the Holocaust or the Shoah. Critical caretaking means unlearning blood and land-centric conceptions of peoplehood and interrelated ethnocentric conceptions of liberation. So instead, Jewish critics stand metaphorically in front of the burning bush, evoking the kind of the biblical image of when Moses was called to emancipate the Israelites from their slavery. The burning bush today entails a form of recommitment to an intersectional conception of liberation, which also entail liberating Jews and Jewish institutions from their ethnocentric militaristic prison. The image of the burning bush is indeed the logo of one of the groups I trace in the book. It's called If Not Now, which explicitly articulates kind of their own positionality in the US context of racial reckoning, where they interpret Jewish liberation as entangled with Black liberation, immigrant rights, Muslim inclusion, Jewish safety, and Palestinian freedom. The name If Not Now, of course, refers to the ancient Rabbi Hillel's 3 questions. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? The group specifies on its website that its understanding of this 3rd question, if not now, when, conveys a sense of moral urgency. The language of their on their kind of self-representation on their website is as follows. Today, the Jewish community is faced with a choice. Will we choose a Judaism that supports freedom and dignity for all Israelis and Palestinians? or will we let the leadership of the establishment define our tradition as incompatible with our values? Will we continue down the path of isolation and fear that's destroying the lives of millions of Palestinians and alienating a generation of young Jews? So this sense of urgency also informs the current today's mobilization of If Not Now's and other critical Jewish organizations such as Jewish Voice for Peace and Jews Against Apartheid, and also including non-Zionist congregations of synagogues that emerged to the scene in recent years as a result of kind of the cyclical and cynical violence that we see, especially directed against Gaza and Gazans. So I will now offer just a very brief glimpse into the kind of Jewish organizing and protest that is happening before reflecting again on why what is unfolding in Palestine, Israel exemplifies a prison within kind of a Jewish power ideology. This is a script that the American Jewish Palestine Solidarity activists I survey try to subvert. For example, again, If Not Now is organizing this coming Shabbat an action called Jews Against Apartheid, Rise Up Shabbat, which is meant to offer a Jewish space for assembly in DC, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, Philadelphia, New York, Toronto, and other cities, with the intention to express morally grounded outrage at Israeli violence and demand that Biden stop using our money to fund apartheid. On May 19th, 2021, so this is yesterday, young Jews organized a protest in front of the Union of Reform Judaism in Manhattan in order to show up and talk to the Jewish establishment and underscore that Palestinian oppression is not the path to Jewish safety. It's time for our community to reckon with the dispossession and displacement of Palestinians and to stop funding it. The group also started a petition for Jews belonging to the reform movement to encourage the leadership of this movement, which is very sizable, to recognize, as does the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, the entire geopolitical space from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea as apartheid regime underpinned by a Jewish supremacist principle. What is implied here is a question whether those spokesperson of Reform Judaism subscribe to Jewish supremacy, and if not, what are they called to do? Also on May 18th, activists with Jewish Voice for Peace were arrested in New York City alongside many more Palestinians and allies, while engaging in actions of civil disobedience that included blocking streets of Midtown Manhattan in support of the Palestinian general strike that happened. In addition, Jewish organizations marked in different ways Nakba Day, that also happened during this, all the violence that has been unfolding. And also one can see American Jews participate in vigils for Palestine organized by Palestine solidarity groups such as Students for Justice for Palestine Chicago, which a group that invited Rabbi Brent Rosen of Tzedek Chicago, a non-Zionist values-based congregation, to speak and grieve together the lives lost. Okay, so these are just brief examples to illustrate the level of moral urgency experienced by many Jewish activists and other Jews not committed to or not subscribing to the cynical manipulation of the ethos of self-defense that Netanyahu and others deploy as a way to kind of distract people from the events in Jerusalem, including the looming dispossession of the families of Sheikh Jarrah, as well as Netanyahu's indictment and corruption and desperate attempt to stay in power. The current escalation doesn't only reveal the mainstreaming of Kahanism or the extreme ultranationalism.
I think Atalia froze on us. So until she comes back, I would like to give, I guess, the two of you the opportunity to respond to each other or to Atalia's comments, which we heard until she froze. Avrum or Sari?
Avram, go ahead.
No, I feel I like to listen to Sari. I feel a feeling of a little bit of imbalance here. I mean, one Palestinian versus too many of us, okay? So
You
as much as I think,
that's a very ethnocentric attitude, Avram.
so, attitude-wise, I'm a Palestinian, as you know, honorary one.
Exactly.
But,
So I'm not
I like
alone
to hear
here.
what-
I'm
I
not
like
alone
to
here.
hear-
Yes.
just give one very small one. I mean, America is not very clear today. I mean, the United States of America is not very clear. Where Trump ends and Biden begins. There is no doubt that one of the achievements of the Israeli conservative government of the last couple of years, that from a binational issue called binational agreement called Israel, it became a bipartisan. It became very partisan, and we have to listen very carefully and very, I would say, happily to the new voices coming from the benches, not necessarily just the backbenches of the Democratic Party. What Atalia said at the beginning, and this is the usage of American weapons, should go to a larger scope, and this is not for now, so I just mention it. If you make the list of the best civil rights countries and governments in the world, you find there's Switzerland, France, Great Britain, United States of America, Canada, and a few other places, and then you make the list of the most significant, important, largest arm exporters in the world, and all of a sudden it's the same, more or less the same people. And you ask yourself, what's going on here? They export their own violence to some other places in order to play and in order to kill each other, and they enjoy civil rights at home. And I say one of the missions in order to put an end to some world violence, and our region included, is to try to limit not just weapons for mass destructions, but weapons for mass destruction of human rights and civil rights, wherever it goes. And how much profit it does to governments and profit it does to businessmen who support governments and to lobbyists, et cetera, et cetera. Having said that, we should put a kind of a policy around that no Israeli weapons can be used in order to abuse or to abuse any human rights and civil rights, even around us and even with the Abraham Agreement governments, etc. And no American weapons can be used in order to continue the oppression of the Palestinian people.
Thank you. Atalia, you froze on us and now you're back. So I want to give you the opportunity to conclude.
I don't know at what point I froze because I was reading my remarks. I mean, I kind of try to just give a sense of the kind of organizing that is happening within American Jewish activists who see themselves as either critical of Israeli policies. I mean, they are on a broad spectrum with respect to their position on Zionism.
Yeah, I think we heard most of your talk actually.
Yeah. And but I kind of concluded by talking about how they are trying to reclaim or reimagine a different kind of Jewishness that is very different than the kind of Jewish supremacist framework that we see ever more pronounced right now in especially, I mean, it's very kind of the Jewish supremacist framework was so clarified in the events that happened leading up to the escalation against Gaza in Jerusalem. I mean, to have the Kanis, the ultra-nationalist actors and their convergences with settlers, violent settlers from the West Bank, and of course working with kind of the collusion with the police and the security framework is a very troubling picture that many of the activists, the Jewish activists, are trying to put in as a mirror in front of the leadership of the establishment. Is this what you mean by Judaism? Is this what you mean by Judaism? And so these are the kind of dynamics that are happening.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask all three of you a question that, in fact, you have, I think, alluded to this question that I'm about to ask in one way or the other, and that is this just another page in this 100-year-old conflict, or are we witnessing a watershed moment in the history of the conflict? Are we witnessing now some paradigm change, shift in the history of this conflict?
Maybe I'll say a word or two here, because I think that in some way, Avram was telling us that this is a watershed in referring to the 5 components that have come back together again in his earlier comments. And in a way, I was also trying to say the same thing by saying that the present events have upfronted 3 major issues that, you know, the 2 sides have been fighting over a period of time. And so there they are. These are the problems that are now facing us. These are the real issues that in the past, as you know, during the Oslo peace process, these issues were pushed aside. They were not confronted. They were not dealt with. And I believe that the time has come, perhaps, and the events have proven that this is necessary for people to confront those issues and to try to address them. Now, the difficult question is, you know, are we going to address them? And how are we going to address them? Who will address them? And whether any difference will be made immediately or in the short term or in the long run. And if so, in what form over time will that be done? I think that, you know, we're confronted again with the major issues, but I'm not sure we still have the tools or the instruments. We haven't maybe learned enough yet of our past failures to be able to deal with what Avram said, and I agree with him, is actually in one sense a new opportunity for us to try and push forward. So it is, yes, a watershed, but then again, it may not be if we don't actually do the right things.
Thank you, Sari.
Fully agreeing with Sari, I would like to add some more to the heap. There is no doubt that, you know, whether it's a watershed or not, after the, I mean, post factum, it's very, very difficult during the event to say, is that an historic moment or just a chronicle one? Having said that, I see a couple of symptoms that I ask myself, what do they mean? I remember only 2, 3, 4 years ago that the Qatar was boycotted by Egypt and by the Saudis. All of a sudden, the Qataris are something else in the region. I ask myself, what are the relationship, the serious relationship between the Egyptians and the Muslim brothers of the Hamas in Gaza? Because in Egypt, they have a legal problem. They try to hide or to suppress or to prison or at least to remove them from the political system. Here, all of a sudden, you have a next door neighbor, which is a state or a semi-state. What does that mean? What does that mean? That we have a reality in which in Gaza, you have a government which in the eyes of many, mine included, is because of its policy and because of its executions or the way it exercises, it's illegitimate one. In Israel, you have a government which is illegitimate not only because of the personality of the prime minister, because it is for almost 3.5 years, it's not a government, but it's a government in transit. In Palestine, you have a government that was not, or a regime that was not elected. So you ask yourself, how can you do history out of politics that none of it is legitimate? And what will replace it? In Israel, eventually will replace it something or somebody which is not Netanyahu. Who will replace Abu Mazen, which is on one hand, the last peacenik in the region and a very, very serious one, but on the other hand, not exactly an open society and a very democratic one. And will there be somebody who will replace Hamas over there? So the question, Asher, the answer to the question of yours, whether it's a watershed depends a lot of the outcome of the political system. Saying that it's about the outcome of the political system, I will add to this one thing, which is a potential direction. I do not believe that everything is about politics. A lot has to do with the psychopolitics, with the psychology of the politics. And I take it that the peace studies that you do over there, psychology is something very, very serious. And the psychopolitics of the region is as follows. When I come to my Palestinian friend and I say to him or to her, listen, I talk to them and say, why violence, why this? He said, you know what, in 48, you perished the history of Palestine. I mean, 400, 500 villages, communities were destroyed, removed, disappeared. And I say, and this is a trauma, he said, that's a tragedy, that's a Nakba. And I say to him as an Israeli, this is a strategy? Wait till you see mine, mine is bigger. And for 75 years, we have a competition of traumas. I deny his, he does not recognize mine, and therefore, everybody says, no, my trauma is bigger. The psychopolitics of a moment like this is to say both sides function under traumas. Let's not compare them. Let's not ask now who is responsible for 48 and 67, though I have a very good answer about it. Let's see from now and on, can we create a reality which will look different? And I'll give you one example of what is a different reality. I told you earlier that my grandchildren are studying, most of them studying in a bilingual, bicultural, binational school. One day, one of my grandchildren came back home, and I asked, Yuval, what did you study in school today? And he said, well, today we didn't really study, there was a birthday. I said, wow, who celebrated? He said, Saba, Grandpa, Muhammad had a birthday. I said, wow, that's beautiful. What did you bring him as a present? He said, Grandpa, not Muhammad, my friend who lives around the corner, Muhammad the Prophet. And I said to myself, wow, the grandchild of my father, who was an ordained Orthodox rabbi, the leader of the National Religious Party, celebrates the birthday as a Jew, as an Israeli, celebrates the birthday of the last prophet. That's a good beginning. And I believe that Asher Dafka begins the watershed rather than the top-down political one, at the psycho-collaboration rather than at the political split.
I think both Atalia and Sari would like to respond or give their own thoughts. So perhaps Atalia, because just to give you the opportunity, and then Sari.
Okay, yeah, I have so many thoughts about this, and also kind of reflections on what Avrum just said about. I mean, I do think that it's very important to refrain from this victimization Olympics, as you refer to it, but also recognize that the Palestinians who became occupied were not the cause of the Shoah, of the Holocaust. And this is very important. And it's not like, I think that an opening will be to stop thinking about the histories and the traumas as a zero-sum game, and this is part of the problem that they are. So here I go back to the very basic, work of Edward Said, but of course also a recent work by Bashir and Amos Goldberg, this edited volume on thinking about the Holocaust and the Nakba together, but not through kind of a zero-sum understanding of history and memory, and think of it as a way of thinking of a different syntax for the future. So having said that, I actually want to reflect on Asher's question about the what's different, or if it's a watershed and whatnot. So I think that I resonate very much with the 3 points that Sari articulated, and I think that there is something, as many other commentators and analysts indicate, there is something that is different, which really manifested in the fact that we saw the first time of a general strike, Palestinian strike, since 1936, which really illuminates the fact that the intentional policy of fragmentation that Israel has engaged in through a variety of mechanisms is eroding. And with it, what is eroding is also the Green Line of 1948, 1949, as the Green Line that is supposedly kind of a geopolitical marker, but also facilitated kind of a normative marker for especially the Israeli peace camp, that, you know, what is wrong is what happened in, you know, 67, those occupied territories, through that myopia of the Nakba and the root cause of questions of justice. And I think that it's a watershed event by looking specifically at the so-called mixed cities, that of course they are only mixed because of the Nakba. It's not that, oh, here we are, we have this model of coexistence. They became mixed because of ethnic cleansing. And the fact that we have an importation of vigilante kind of settler violence that was always had kind of involved the collusion with the security forces and the government into those, you know, the quote unquote proper Israel, really is what is different. I mean, you had people from settlements in the West Bank, Bas to Lid or Lod, to basically engage in, like, you know, lynching and targeting Palestinian Israelis. And this is something that is really forcing a different kind of thinking. And but let's think about it constructively, in the sense of, well, maybe there was something highly problematic in thinking of the Green Line as a normative line, and that inform a kind of what I call a segregationist peace formula. Because that segregationist peace formula dependent on, you know, exclusionary understanding of citizenship, which takes me to Sari's point about the Jewish and democratic riddle that just doesn't work out through kind of a supremacist ideological framework. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Atalia. Sari, please.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say, with regard to the Nakba and the Holocaust, you know, it's not the case in general that Palestinians will deny or will downsize the tragic, you know, event of the Holocaust. I don't think they are, you know, connected in our minds. It's certainly not in my mind or minds of people, Palestinians that I know and interact with. We recognize, I mean, we all know, you know, that this horrible thing happened in Europe by Europeans against Jews. We know that. And we're not surprised that the Europeans have done that to Jews, because you know, historically, we know that there's been a lot of racism in that part of the world against all kinds of people. Now, but this, on the one hand, does not make me accept having a Nakba on my part. You see, there's a difference. I never try to compare or to between the two things, but I think that, you know, however tragic that tragedy was, I feel that, on the other hand, I've undergone a Nakba, and the Nakba was done at the hands of the very people who were thrown into that horrible Holocaust in Europe before. Anyway, you know, just to let you know, I mean, for instance, I remember when my mother was alive, and sometimes would put on the TV and watch. In Israel, that, you know, Israeli TV would, you know, always show us the Nakba, I mean, the Holocaust story on certain dates, of course. And I remember my mother saying, you know, put it out, put it off. I don't want to see it. And I tell her, why don't you want to see it? And she said, you know, it's their pain. I don't want to see them when they are causing pain to me. She's not saying that she doesn't recognize that the Jews have gone through pain, but she doesn't want to see that taking over the pain that is done to her. And, you know, she's gone through a lot of pain as a family, as you may know. But anyway, I want to come back to saying that it seems to me that we're maybe going around, at least in my own mind, I'm going around in circles now as I'm participating in this panel. I feel I want to go back to one or two things that I heard on the panel, including now from Natalia, but also earlier from Avram, which is, where do you start? So you have a space between the river and the sea, let us say, and can you begin there from the bottom up with some basic principle, some basic human principle, say concerning rights, and if you can, taking into account the different concerns and the different problems and the different aspirations of the different people there that are living in that part of the world, then the question is, how do you go about trying to translate that basic human principle into institutional practice? How can you translate, how can you materialize something institutionally based upon such a principle? And this is where we have failed. And I don't see how, Qatar or Egypt, or, by the way, concerning Hamas, I think it's wrong to think that, the guys in Gaza are just Hamas, or that Hamas is just Hamas. Hamas is just a front, and, a lot of people are Hamas in that sense, that everybody's unhappy on the Palestinian side with what's happening to them, and that's done to them by Israel. And all Palestinians, therefore, are at one at the moment in wanting to change the situation in the sense of, creating an institution or creating a reality based on a principle of justice. That's the basic human principle that one wants to begin with. And how do you do that? Now, I don't see how I wish somebody could tell me or help me think of how this can be actually done. I mean, okay, Abbas, our Abbas, say Abu Mazen tomorrow is elected out of office. Maybe someone else is put in office. Maybe someone else's, elections in Gaza and Israel. But then what? How can we work together? How can we use the network that Avram spoke about first? How can you create a movement? How can you create a movement that can actually impact the reality of politics? And the reality of politics is not something simple. I mean, it needs giants to move political institutions. And it takes time. But even so, one has to try and work out some kind of vision. One has to think of stages, phases. One has to think of, psychology, economics, whatever. One has to put it together. And I don't think it's been done. And I say this out of just knowing what people have been doing in trying to make peace or not make peace over the past 50, 60 years, 80 years, whatever. I think not enough work has been done, and not necessarily in the right way. And I think we are still lost. And I'm worried this opportunity that now exists before us, this opportunity in which we once again are made to see reality as it is, and know what we have to face and know what we have to deal with, that we're not going to be able to do anything about it. I'm worried about that.
Thank you. Avram, I see that you are raising your virtual hand.
If this possible, very briefly.
Okay.
Sari's challenge is a very serious one, and are ready to give a direction and to spend a couple of years in Indiana in order to flesh it up, okay? Having said that, it will be, I think, as follows: within Israel and between the Jordan and Mediterranean, two different scenarios. What the corona showed is something very interesting. Jerusalem as a center of power, as a central government, got very, very weak during the COVID. And in a way, we are witnessing a kind of a fantastic de facto Switzerlandization. How will you say it? I mean, Israel is becoming Switzerland, cantonized.
Balkanization, you mean, or Switzerlandization?
In cantonization is easier than Swissaization, whatever it is. Cantonize into the Arab community, behave differently, the ultra-Orthodox differently, Tel Aviv differently, Jerusalem differently, and in a way, the central Jerusalem is much weaker, and Israel during COVID expressed a very interesting birth of an idea of a society, not of a melting pot, one Jerusalem policy, but a country of all of its communities. We're not yet there. It's very embryonic. It's very, very early, but I see the direction. And if we develop this, it might give, among others, the Palestinian cause a lot of space for autonomous expressions. Between the Jordan and Mediterranean, unfortunately, with the same energy that people like myself invested so many years ago about the two-state solution, I think it is dead. Oslo expired. And now the discussion is, what kind of one state do we have? Is it a one state with two regimes, one full of privileges for Jews and one full of discrimination for Palestinians? Or will it be a one state, as difficult as it is, that looks differently? The ground floor will be the constitutional one that I mentioned before. Every individual has the right for the same rights. The mezzanine floor will be two political entities. In Israel, most of the issues of the Jewish political community will be resolved, and in Palestine, most issues of the Palestinian political community will be resolved. And on top of it, there will be a third floor. That will be the confederation in which the cooperation will begin. First, with infrastructure and resources and sustainability, and all the other issues which are less controversial, later on to education, later on for economic development, later on even to share power, and eventually to a full-scale three-floor confederation.
Thank you.
How do you get there?
Yes.
How do you get there? There is a couple of years in Indiana.
So I'm actually, as a moderator of this panel, I'm faced now with a challenge because we have about 100 questions, and I can ignore them all together and let us have this continued conversation between us, or somehow bring into the conversation at least some of the questions, and then let you choose if you want to challenge Avrum and actually come up to show us how he comes up with a plan to achieve this. So some of the questions that we received is directly perhaps tied to the issue that you raised, and that is political leadership in the country, both inside Israel and among Palestinians. The question of the crisis of leadership on the Israeli side, Hamas as an emerging power that makes a claim for exclusive leadership of the Palestinians. And I wonder if we can speak about that part of the situation right now, and perhaps also if you are able to square the circle and answer Avrum, the challenge of Avrum, through thinking about the political reality right now. That would be greatly appreciated, I think, also by the many questions that we received from our audience. Floor is open. Go ahead, Sari.
So sorry, I was I think thinking what to do with myself to get to smoke outside. I think, but what would you like me to answer or address myself to?
I think at least a large part of the audience asked questions about leadership in Israel and among Palestinians, and I wonder if you can respond to that, the challenge of leadership on the Israeli and the Palestinian side.
Well, I'll not answer on the part of the Israelis because I have, I think I'll leave that to Avram. I think they've got a problem in Israel, but I think we've got a problem as well, in the sense that, for the past 15 years, I mean, I think somebody mentioned at the beginning of this panel that we have a leadership that's not been elected. Actually, it was an elected leadership. The problem is that for the last 15, 16 years, we haven't had elections. We were just about to have elections when suddenly Abbas pulled out, and he pulled out by claiming that he wanted to be able to do it in Jerusalem as well, and that the Israelis were not allowing him to do it. But everybody was of the opinion that he was just pulling out because he was worried that he will, in fact, fail in those elections. Now, at some point or another, once the dust has settled, I think there'll be another push to have those elections happen. Now, the question is, will Hamas in particular as a movement actually win those elections? And my sense is they will probably have a good winning, but they will not have a majority in any future elections. Not that it will happen today. I mean, today, maybe if you go to elections today, people are sort of euphoric about all these guns and rockets and so on, and they might sort of vote for a Hamas government. But I think, in a couple of months' time, when things have settled, people will come back to thinking about themselves, about their lives. At the end of the day, there's a human cost and pain for what's happened, and people will come back to this and will wish to seek means or methods to try and regain the ability to live a normal life. And I think they'll go for elections. And I think the national movement, in general terms, that's the PLO, will probably once again be able to get the majority number of seats in the Legislative Council. Now, whether that will happen, whether there will be elections, whether the PLO will be there, I'm not sure. But certainly we are going to see changes in our leadership in different ways and over time. And I think, again, maybe the strength of any particular political party that's going to be in office will be determined to some extent insofar as it is able or not able to provide the people with what the people will be wanting, down the road. That's on the Palestinian side. But, again, to go back to Hamas, I want to just emphasize that, in my view, the people that were fighting in Gaza against Israel or defending themselves were not just the Hamas movement, the Muslim Brothers. There were different factions, and the factions sort of spread between different Islamic factions, but also national factions and PLO factions. So it wasn't just Hamas fighting or defending itself. It was the people of Gaza. The people of Gaza are, belong to everybody, to every sort of possible faction that you can think of, or factions that you can't think of, or no factions. So it was a united kind of position. Now, that's as far as the Palestinian leadership is concerned. I hope we'll be able to have elections. There's a lot of talk, I must tell you perhaps, that there's a lot of talk among Palestinian intellectuals about whether we need what has been popular so far as a leadership institution, whether we need the PLO in the form it exists. Because today people are saying, the PLO went down the wrong road, they went down Oslo Road, they've taken us to a mess, they made us accept the fragmentation of the Palestinian population, they made us forget the fact that, our main claim, initial claim was Palestine. It ended up being 22% of the country. So we need a different leadership, a leadership that will represent Israeli Palestinians, West Bank Palestinians, Gaza Palestinians, Palestinians in the diaspora. And, it may be that there will be a push in the next few years, year, 2 years, 3 years, to try and create a kind of general agency, Palestinian agency, which will somehow represent the different components of the Palestinian population in the different parts of the world. But whatever happens, we will continue having a problem about how in this country, in Palestine, between the river and the sea, we will be able to conduct our affairs, manage our affairs. I very fully agree that if we have this three-tier system that Avram just told us, if that can be constructed, it's fine. I'm in favor of any kind of peace between Israelis and Palestinians based on the principle that he told us, or any basic human principle that we're all equal. And then, you know, just let us know how you want to do the equality thing. I think most Palestinians are like me. I mean, I know they don't say that if you ask them, but I think deep in their hearts, people are like that. They, you know, they will accept anything if it is based on justice, if they feel it is based on a basic principle of equality. But how do you get there? I mean, it's not enough to say we accept. There've been sort of offers made to Palestinians, Palestinians made to Israelis over the years, and they all look very beautiful offers over the years, but we don't seem to be there. And so we need a push, or, you know, we need a miracle. I'm not sure. Or Notre Dame.
We'll go back to Notre Dame and the miracle perhaps in a few minutes. Atalia, I want to give you the opportunity to respond.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to respond to the point about that image of this the Swissization of the space, but to highlight that it's very you know, this image is very different than what the reality, a reality that is actually manifest in what some people call the Hebronization of the entire space. So, which again, we see kind of in action in the quote unquote mixed cities, where, you know, there is an effort to, you know, engage in another manifestation of ethnic cleansing. So this is the reality of Hebronization, of the Jewish state law, that passed in 2018, and so very, very concerning developments of that kind of an embrace, a move away from even any kind of lip service to that construct of Jewish and democratic. This now it's just Jewish. You have stronger and stronger voices that articulate this, and again, it is as the B'Tselem report, it is one regime from the river to the sea that is underpinned by a Jewish supremacist ideology and hegemony. And so I think well, I feel a strong affinity with kind of understanding of organic, grassroots, bottom-up, you know, relationship building, and you know, that will be oriented by human rights and questions of justice. I feel very strongly connected to those images. I think that what, like, in terms of what needs to be done and how to get there, I cannot. I just want to stress, to underscore the importance of the international international actors and their complicity. Like we mentioned, the you know, the U.S. support, unconditional support, and the fact that we want to welcome the kind of shifts that we observed, that I mentioned briefly within the Democratic Party, but we cannot. I mean, the realities are such that that people who are oriented toward those possibilities of just futures, however they are going to be scripted, are completely bypassed by Christian Zionist lobby in the US that is channeling so many resources and also exert a lot of pressure on the American kind of domestically within the US, and that has implications, direct policy implications in Palestine, Israel. And so, so I think that there are already frameworks and discourses that help to think of ways to change the conversation. For instance, the call of Palestinian civil society for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. This is a very, you know, historically recognized and admired modes of tactics to exert pressure to influence change, because Israel has been engaging in annexationist policies regardless of Oslo, and also, of course, it was a mechanism to entrench the occupation with total impunity. And so, the fundamental change would need to happen in how this narrative is conveyed outside.
Thank you. We are at Notre Dame, and I think a large part of our audience is from Notre Dame, and Tantour is run by Notre Dame. And I think one of the issues that is really of interest to our audience is how should the university respond to this challenge? How would the university think constructively about its work in Jerusalem, in Tantour, in light of some of the challenges that we have discussed? And I want to give the opportunity I want to ask Daniel to respond to that question first before the rest of the panelists, since you are there and you are our person in Tantour, the university's person in Tantour. So Daniel, your thoughts about that?
Thanks, Asho. That's a very that's a minefield there, but okay. I think that first, we are a university, right? So we're definitely a place for academic research, for people to have discussions, and a place where people should be heard from, even irrespective of their opinions. And I think there the university kind of already aligns with what Tantour has tried to be in the past, and has been a refuge for these discussions and a place for people to voice different opinions. The university is obviously also an American Catholic Christian university, that stands for human rights and for justice. And it is its obligation as well to address and point to injustice if it sees it. But at the same time, we're visitors here. The university is not the landowner of this country, and
of Tantour.
Well, not neither of Tantour, but I think that is something that we need to recognize, that the university is a visitor here, and the ability for us to it's not our it's also our duty to try to keep that Socratic notion of assuming that we don't understand what needs to happen. And I think that we have a role vis-a-vis our students, especially when they come to this country. Many of them, after a week here, think they can write a book and come up with all the solutions that are needed. And if they stay for a semester, then that book becomes an article. And if they stay for 2 semesters, that article becomes a paragraph, and then it basically vanishes with time. And then but at the beginning, they do come with that demeanor, that we've understood all the problems, we know who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, and we know how to come up with these solutions. So that is also our responsibility vis-a-vis our students, to try and, hey, many people have tried to think about this problem, and maybe you think the root causes of this, but how to come to that place is completely different. And that's, I think, what links also with us here being a Christian institute in East Jerusalem. We are in the US, we like to think that we're part of the hegemony. Here, we're part of the minority of the minority. So that balance is important to remember, and I think that also gives us some excuses in terms of what people should be expecting us to do and what not. I don't know if that was too vague, but I hope.
Yes. Avram, I do not know if you were thinking about that, because I know you spend almost every morning working at the space, the library.
First, I walk in and I say to myself, what me, an offspring of Jewish Orthodoxy, doing among 100,000 books about Jesus? But, well, you know, it's interesting. But I put it as follows. I think that the potential of the place is almost unlimited. It's an oasis, which is, Danny said, we're not the owners of the land, but in a way, it's a kind of a spiritual no man's land that both Palestinians and Israelis, both Jews, Christians, and Muslims, can come and meet without the baggages of the political normalcy and the BDS and you name it. And therefore, the place has a huge potential. Only could we merge on site two dynamics. The first dynamic is the dynamic of your Center for Peace Studies, and the second is the practical extended arm of the Consulium Vaticanum Secundum, which is the Second Vatican Council, which happened in 1965 was the resolution. Among other things came the Nostra Aetate and everything, and bring together both the new church approach towards conversations within Christianity, but between Christianity and other religions, Jews and others, and what you do there, and can have a center in Jerusalem that will be a serious educational think tank and think and do tank with your students and with the local powers. It might serve the inspirational side that Sari is asking, how will it start? It will start with a good think and good thoughts that this place can provide. And I know that under the leadership of Dani, a lot of motivation is expressed. Will the university come? Will the Vatican come? I don't know. I can assure you that once these energies will be broadcasted and radiated from the place, more than hundreds of Israelis and Palestinians will say, we're ready to listen.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have really 3 minutes before our time is up. So I want to give each one of you 30 seconds to think about, constructive paths forward 10 years from now. Daniel, you are also welcome to join us with your 30 seconds. 10 years from now, where would we be in a constructive way? Sari, please.
Well, I think, we'd be living in the country as equals. People will feel happy with their lot, satisfied. You can't really create paradise on earth, but you can come close to it. You can do something that will make people feel that life is actually not just worthy in itself for living, but also for enjoying as part or as a component in a larger context. And I think, in theory, this is possible. I think, however, I get the feeling just talking, I'm taking more than 30 seconds, but I just want to say that I think, there are people of goodwill, and I can see you in the panel as belonging to that group of people. But, I look a little bit more broadly, and I worry that the real world is not run necessarily by such people. And it will take us longer than 10 years, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Atalia, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, of course, I want to, I want to think of being a part of the space that will centralize human rights and equal citizenship, but that has to happen not through kind of a discourse of myopia, of pretending that equality comes from nowhere, but rather through a process of redressing and thinking of ways, concrete ways to redress historical injustice. That includes thinking about the right of return of the refugees, to go back to Sari's, one of Sari's initial points. Thinking of historical injustice on multiple levels, I think that one of the challenges for the Israeli Jewish society is to come to terms with, it's not one thing, it's not a homogeneous society. And I'm especially thinking of the constructive space that that Arab Jews or Jews that are not tracing their roots to Europe can help in kind of guidance in terms of reconnecting to thinking about being Jewish in the space in ways that are non-hegemonic, in ways that connects to cultural, linguistic inheritances. That actually for Israeli Jews to learn Arabic will be a major step in the right direction. And also relinquishing the fantasy that Israel is in Europe. Israel is not in Europe. And so I'll stop here.
Thank you. Avrum, 30 seconds.
I'll end with my mom, okay? The reality will not be my mom's one. But if I try not to necessarily predict, but try to say what I want, I will say, I hope that in 10 years' time, Sari will quit smoking and start running marathons with me. So I say the first marathon Sari will run will be Bethlehem Marathon of 2031, okay? That's item number one. Item number two, I hope that in 10 years' time, Netanyahu's trial will be over. Having said that, now that we got rid of the two real main obstacles, I will say the following. I know that we're at the junction. And since I'm an optimist, unlike my mom, and I said I'm not like my mom, I hope that in 10 years' time, we shall see much clearly different partition lines than we see today. Today, the partition line, especially under pressure and under fire, is all of us versus all of them. This is what is seen. And I hope that in 10 years' time, the partition line will look a bit different. Some of us and some of them versus some of us and some of them, which means people like Sari and myself can cooperate along so many things and so many practices, and despite some disagreements versus some of our extremists and fundamentalists and their fundamentalists and extremists. And therefore, a reality in which some of us and some of them versus some of us and some of them creates a different political landscape within Palestine, within Israel, and in between the two. Why do I say it? It's not unlike my mom. We used to ask my mom, Mom, what are you? Are you a pessimist or an optimist? She said, moi? Me? Of course I'm an optimist. Today is much better than tomorrow. I think differently.
Yes. Yeah. You remind me of Emil Habibi's very important novel, The Optimist. Yes.
Optimist.
Yes. Optimist, right. Daniel, do you want to share with us your own 30 seconds of conclusion?
Sure. I think that one very important thing is for the people who want to be peacemakers is to recognize that we live, whether we like it or not, in a completely neoliberal world. And that is something that I think a lot of the non-peacemakers have understood and are using that. And only the peacemakers are able to use these neoliberal tools will they also be able to play on a global level to make change. That change is not always very democratic in the sense of the grassroots that we've all described, unfortunately. But these are the new games, the rules that we have, and we have to leverage on them. So I think if we do, then next time it will look differently.
Thank you. You opened a whole new can of worms by introducing neoliberalism, but that will take us to another hour and a half of conversation. So already time is up, so we have to conclude. Thank you all for your participation, particularly for those from Jerusalem. Thank you, Atalia, for really insightful and thoughtful contribution to our conversation. And let's hope that we do not need to meet again for another panel after another violence, but actually our next panel will be about some constructive developments in Jerusalem. Thank you all, and thank you for those who attended and listened to our panel. Good night and good afternoon for us here.
Thank you, thank you,
Bye.
thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
bye-bye.